Hi, folks. Lovely to see you all this evening. Thanks so much for coming along to the last of these webinars. So it's been great to spend 5 weeks with you. And actually, I think, unlike last time, we got through unscathed. There were no cancellations or anything. So yeah, last time we had to jiggle some stuff around because of, I think, bad weather. So a lesson learned that this is a slightly better time of year to do it, particularly given that it can get pretty poor weather up here in Scotland. So yeah, really nice to have spent 5 weeks with you, and really looking forward to finishing off with today's session, and delighted that Dan has joined us as our resident expert, as it were, this evening. And we also have Fidelity. So nice to see Fidelity. Sam is here, and it looks like Fergus is as well, and David. We've got almost a full house of farmer experts, which is fantastic, and lots of opportunity to kind of share ideas and thinking. I did set you a bit of homework at the end of last session, but I don't think any's been sent through, and that was just to identify any kind of problem areas or challenges. But maybe you can have a think about those as we go through the session, and at the end ask questions about those. So we did have a bit of a chat about a couple of challenges individuals were having last week, so it would be really nice to maybe pick into that a little bit after my presentation. So as usual, I'm going to present and then we'll go into a conversation. But this is your last opportunity in this series to kind of ask any questions if you do have them about soil health or about any of the themes that we've covered over the last month. And so if there is anything that you've got a burning question on, please do make sure you ask it either in the chat or you can unmute as we go through. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. So bear with me a second. There we go. Oh. Right, hopefully you can see that. You can see a photo of my my husband in the snow. So this evening session is managing in extremes. So as we've talked about throughout all of these webinars, having an adaptive system is going to be vital in a changing and more varied climate. We know that even over the last couple of years, weather events are becoming more challenging. We're having prolonged drought periods, particularly you guys down in the southeast, followed by really, really wet weather. And I think particularly on the east of the country, this is just not something we're used to. That we tend to be much drier in the east, and actually having these much wetter weathers is really wetter weather events is really challenging. And I think it's kind of really, I'm finding it just kind of pretty soul destroying as well. We're just not used to it. So hopefully having a look at some of these different management approaches can help us to be more adaptive whilst maintaining system efficiency, because what we don't want is to then have to make decisions that have a significant impact on the bottom line financially. And we always want to look to being able to do things as efficiently as we possibly can, and make sure that we're trying to cut costs out whilst ensuring high animal health, welfare and soil health. So it's trying to bring all of this together and actually being able to deliver a very resilient system, even when all the different plates are spinning and all the challenges are coming at you. And I thought it'd be great to have Dan with us this evening, because from a dairy point of view, you often have kind of fewer options. So it'd be really interesting to kind of listen to the whole system changes that have been made to better cope with those challenges as we go through, because particularly within, for example, a beef system or in a sheep system, it is much easier to kind of really slow down animal growth and really kind of take some of the expectation out of those animals, because you're not having to hit a kind of daily output. You can really take things a bit slower. But it'll be really great, I think, to hear from Dan as we go through. So let's crack on. And we haven't got a huge number of slides, but I think the thing that I really want to kind of come back to all the time is this idea of soil armor. And this is the thing that is going to be the key aspect, or the key part of our planning, that is going to get us through the most challenging weather, whether that is really hot weather, whether it's really wet weather events, or whether it's long-term frosts and snow. The more we have above ground, the more resilient we can be. But as we know, having grazing animals whose job it is to eat what's above ground means that can be quite difficult, because the more we're growing it, the more they're going to be eating it. So managing and planning for that long-term recovery, that taller grass covers, that more biomass above ground, really is the thing that is going to make a significant difference to us. And that could be that you're extending your rest periods by moving your animals more slowly across the grazing platform. It could be that you're taking areas completely out of grazing during the summer or during the kind of spring period. And these are all things that we've talked about over the last few weeks about how we create as much soil armor, as much cover as we possibly can. And so it really is interesting. This was an image that was shared by Understanding Ag. Now, Understanding Ag are an amazing organization based in the US. It's kind of Gabe Brown, Alan Williams, and others who are involved in that. And they have some really, really great resources available on their website. So I definitely recommend having a look at their work. This is a photograph taken in the US, showing just how the difference between the temperature at ground level between these two areas. So I wouldn't worry too much about the kind of area of poor biology and areas of better biology, but actually thinking about if we can create more of what's on the left-hand side, those tall covers, look at the difference it can make in terms of the surface of the ground. So if we have an ambient temperature, and this is degrees Celsius, by the way, if we have an ambient temperature of just under 30 degrees Celsius, which is going to become fairly normal for you guys in the southeast, then actually the shorter ground, the shorter grass covers gets a lot hotter than that. So the ground starts to bake, it really starts to heat up. However, if we have those taller covers, we can see that we have a much lower temperature near to the soil, which means that we avoid the ground baking. So those of you on clay, you'll all know that if you have really, really hot weather, the clay starts to bake and to crack. So if you can keep it covered, if you can keep those temperatures down, you're going to have much more resilient soils. It also means that the conditions are more appropriate to help those grasses grow because of the types of grasses that we have in the UK. So we don't necessarily have really, really hot weather grasses. So they're not really developed and designed, and they haven't been bred if we're using cultivar species to cope with hot temperatures. So the more that we can do to keep that soil covered, the better chance we have of allowing our grasses to recover. And really interestingly, I know that through the mob grazing group, in not the summer just gone, but the summer before, for many people who were burning up, there were lots of folk mob grazing with taller covers who were managing to avoid that issue of burning up grass. And where it was happening, really interestingly, in terms of diversity, it was the bird's foot trefoil that kept coming through again and again. So having that diversity of plants is also really important, because it means that whatever the conditions are, there's always going to be some plant that can cope better than others. So there's always going to be something that is regrowing and is able to provide food for your cattle or your sheep. Again, just another example, and I think particularly thinking about the road and the road surface, and a nice example of kind of mown grass, tall scrubby grass around the tree, and then into the field. So we've got an air temperature of over 30 degrees in this photo. We've got a road that is sitting at 47.8 degrees C. That is absolutely baking. That's so hot. Next to that, it's only a little bit less where the grass has been mown. So the difference between mown grass and tarmac really is insignificant. You know, you might as well be trying to put your animals out onto a hot road rather than onto grass if your covers are that short. You can see around the base of that tree or that shrub that there's a lot of kind of scrubby, weedy grass, if you like. And the temperature in there was 22 degrees. So really, really the lowest, coolest, nicest place to be in that. I think it's a maize crop, it looks like, on the right-hand side. Again, there's decent cover, so it is much cooler, but out in the middle of the field where actually there's not much kind of shelter and it's probably pretty open, there's going to be quite a lot of gaps between those plants, the temperature is going to get up again. So the thicker the sward density, the more plants we have, the taller those covers, the less regular, if you like, so the more irregular, the more permanent the pasture, the more likely with the tall covers you are to keep those cooler temperatures. And I know that isn't viable for everybody, and you'll be in various different systems, for example, with herbal lays going in after an arable crop and having to manage different outcomes, but actually, you know, thinking about what's the optimal, and it would seem from this photograph in terms of temperature mediation, an optimal would be something like permanent pasture, tall covers. So how can we always be trying to manage back towards that as much as we possibly can, thinking about biomimicry as a way to help us to create a more resilient system. So if we've got these baking soils, then it's very easy to understand why these flash floods would happen after drought. So in normal conditions, we've got our lovely connected porosity below soil, which we've talked about a lot. We've got all of that biomass above soil, and we've got that rain coming in. So the water, the the water droplets, as they're coming down, their energy is being dispersed by the forage. So that, for one, means that we're reducing the risk of capping at the soil surface. So that green forage is reducing, it's taking the energy out of those water droplets, and it's breaking them down, so it's easier for them. They get slowed down as they start to come close to the soil, and then because of that deep root mass, that connected porosity, the water is able to infiltrate, and the soil absorbs water like a sponge. However, if all of our grasses burn off and we haven't got much of it left at all, and the spaces between the grasses have started to get bigger, and particularly thinking back to those clay soils where the top has become cracked and hard, there isn't anywhere for that water to go, and that water is going to be hitting that soil surface as quickly as it possibly is coming out of the sky. Its energy isn't being dissipated, it's going straight onto that soil, and it's going to create surface capping, because just the energy of it hitting that baking soil, it's just going to create, it's almost like hitting it, pounding it, it's going to become even harder, and the water is just going to create this hard layer of soil that will then repel the water, and off it disappears down the hill, taking some surface nutrients with it, but also then potentially washing away some of that soil, and more worryingly, creating flash floods downhill. So the more that we can keep that biomass, not only is it going to keep the temperature cooler for the soil, which creates optimal growing conditions, it's also nicer for the animals to be on. If you imagine you're a big ruminant who's generating heat all the time with that rumen, if we're asking them then to lie on short grass, they're going to be really uncomfortable if it's at 40 degrees centigrade, for example. But if we can give them cooler pastures, bit lusher for them to lie on where possible, they're going to be much happier in being able to moderate their own temperature as well. So what we really want to make sure is we've got all of that biomass to create those more normal conditions that reduce the risk of that water runoff and can keep those temperatures nice and low. And this kind of builds into or ties into the much kind of bigger system of the water system, if you like, if we have a high pressure or a low pressure system. So if we've got soil that is bare and compacted, and we have rainfall, so we've got this kind of greenhouse effect of this persistent haze that is combination of pollution, of dust, of smoke, of, if we've got a lot of particles that are kind of getting into the air, we all know what kind of smoggy summer days can be like, particularly if you're near an urban area. If we have that persistent haze, we get that increased greenhouse effect, where actually the heat is trapped closer to the ground, and it means that we're not able to actually create a cooling space for our animals. So if you think on the left hand side, we're just creating this greenhouse that is making everything hotter. So it's hot anyway, it's getting hotter. That heating phenomenon is compounded, and it just gets worse and worse. The rainfall is rejected, we get flooding, we get drought. It's very easy to kind of understand it if we think about getting into a baking hot greenhouse. We've basically created an oven below this kind of haze area. Whereas if we have these much more green, luscious covers, we've got a lot more trees, we've got a lot more green matter, we've got all of those roots that are creating that soil carbon sponge, we are able to dissipate the implications and the impact of that heat. We may well have these convective storms from these clouds that are, this is kind of, I guess, geography pre-GCSE, but if we have that really hot weather and we get lots of water vapor and we get those big convective clouds and we then have a deluge, but actually the impact of that is significantly reduced, because as I said, the speed of the water droplets is significantly reduced, their energy is reduced as they hit the ground, but we've also got that sponge ready to absorb all of that water. So rainfall is infiltrated, and then we have a cycle, we have a functioning cycle. That cycle and the benefits that are multiplied out, so we get less flooding and less drought. So when we're thinking about the cycles on our farm, so the nutrient cycle, the carbon cycle, the water cycle, the more green that we can get on our farm, the better that is for the blue, for the water. So green, more green means more blue. And when we have these kind of rainfall events, and we're in a drought and we're able to store that water, it means that we can make use of it. One of the biggest challenges that we have is if we have baked soil and water hits it from rain and disappears, we then can't make the most of that. We're not able to use that water to help grow plants. Whereas if we've got plants that can help to dissipate that rainfall as it comes in, and we can soak it up in our soil carbon sponge, then it means that we can make the most of that. And interestingly, I think, as I said in some of the mob grazing groups, we had some really nice examples of very hot weather last summer. So not the summer just gone, the one before particularly, where folk were noticing that with tall grass, it was able to catch the dew, and that sort of recognizing that those taller covers were able to catch what tiny little bit of dew that there might be, which then was condensing, running down the stem, and was providing some water for that plant, which was better than nothing. So it's all kind of linked between, these links between having healthy soils, healthy plants, being able to mitigate the impact of these broken cycles that we're having to try and manage our way out of due to climate change. So from one extreme to another, I want to talk a little bit about cold weather, and I'm kind of galloping through this because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for chat and discussion. So these are my cattle. So we keep our cows out all year round. All of our cattle are outside all year round, even in really deep snow. Sheep and cattle can thrive in temperatures right down to -12 degrees. So because of the rumen, actually cattle in particular, because of their size, but also sheep, are working quite hard quite often to actually keep their temperature down. A lot of their energy goes into staying cool, which is why in those hot conditions we want to create as much shade or give them as access to as much breeze as we possibly can. But in cold conditions, as long as it's not kind of blowing a hoolie and it's not really wet, you can see in this photograph, yes, there's a lot of snow, but actually, and it's cold, but there isn't much wind, it's not wet, so actually animals really can thrive when it does get right down into the minus numbers. And we have weeks up here at a time where it's -15 to -20, particularly in sort of January and February. And that rumen acts as a radiator, so we always feed late in the day so that they can stay nice and warm overnight, because their rumen is going to be processing all of that forage during the night when it's coldest, which allows them to stay much warmer than if they had going to bed, if you like, on an empty stomach. We want them to go to bed on a nice full belly. And we use bale grazing as a way to manage winter feeding and creating a dry bed. I do not mind one bit if my cows want to lie on that hay. That's not a problem. It's much cheaper than bedding up in a straw shed, if I had one. And it also means that they're going to be happy and content. If I have to stick extra bales out for that, then that's not a problem. That in our context makes absolute sense. So in order to cope with these cold weather challenges that we're going to be having, or particularly this constant wet weather, ongoing wet weather that just feels like it's never ending, we have to have animals that go into winter in really good body condition. And that means that we've had to manage them well during the summer. Now, if we're dealing with challenging summers where it's really, really hot, or it's really, really wet, and it's more difficult to manage the animals, then it can be difficult to cope with that extreme when it comes back around in the next season. So all of this is always a kind of challenge about managing these trade-offs, managing these impacts that we're dealing with from one season to another, always with the following season in mind. So always thinking about, if you're going to be out wintering, if you're going to have animals out in challenging conditions, how can I make sure they go into winter as fat as they possibly can? Which also goes against kind of conventional housed animal kind of management, where you don't want animals to go into housing too fat, and you're kind of spending your winter reducing their feed intake. So for example, if you're spring calving, or going into your lambing period with animals that aren't overweight. But actually, if you can push animals outside, that all of that happens naturally. And I think we've kind of, as humans, forgotten that it's very normal to kind of build up fat reserves as we go into winter and then lose them through a more challenging season. And we definitely can see the benefit of that in cattle. I would also really recommend, just as an add-on, you saw a wee video from Rob Havard in last week's session. Rob's Nuffield video has just come out from last week, and would really recommend reading that report when it's available. He talks about how animals can adapt to really challenging systems, and kind of building in that functional resilience, and the benefits of pushing animals and kind of testing them to some extent to kind of find the ones that really do thrive. So just on a side note, would really recommend going and having a look at that if you have time. So yeah, in our cold weather, there are other challenges. Dan and I were just having a chat about them before we started the webinar, about managing water. That's something for us that we're always having to think about. Maybe less of a challenge for you guys down south, but maybe then there's a risk of kind of complacency of, oh, it's fine having all these pipes overground, because it never gets that cold. All of our pipes are overground as well. So yeah, we're always having to try and manage around that, and we can maybe chat about some of the detail of that as we go into the Q&A at the end of the session. So I guess the main things to think about in terms of this hot weather, these cold weathers, is the more cover we have on the ground, the better. And that comes back to, you've seen this slide maybe 4 times now. It is one of my favorite. I do keep sharing it. This idea that adaptive grazing allows us to build rest into the system, but that rest means that we can get those roots down, we can get those covers up, we can have animals that are in a situation where they've got the best possible opportunity to get as much of their energy requirement from the forage in front of them, whilst maintaining healthy soil structure and keeping those living roots doing their thing, cycling those nutrients, creating the optimal environment for all of that microbiology under the soil. So I think, if there's anything that comes out of these sessions and you're thinking about your system and how you can adapt and improve or change your system, it's, how can you build more rest? And that rest maybe is needed at different times of the year to build different types of stockpile, whether that's a summer stockpile or a winter stockpile. But building that rest and recovery, and particularly during the summer, is going to be the thing that allows you to have that resilience to go through any extremes that are thrown at you. There's some really nice examples of outwintering discussion happening on Twitter at the moment, obviously, because of the time of year. Really recommend having a look at Edinvale Farm. So Jock is Pasture for Life certified. He's about 20-30 minutes up the road from me in northeast Scotland, and his kind of change to his outwintering approach over the last sort of 10 years has been really interesting. So if you're on Twitter or X, whatever it's called these days, really recommend going and having a look at Edinvale Farms thread on outwintering, because it's kind of some really nice food for thought in terms of, why do we make the decisions that we do, and what are the impacts that they're seeing and what's driving those decision changes. Okay, so that is the end of the slides. So let me stop sharing. Oh, there's suddenly loads of people appeared who weren't here a little while ago. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to come to Dan first, just with a couple of questions. So Dan, we talked a bit there, or I've talked a bit about kind of challenging weather, and just interested in your thoughts, particularly being in the southeast, some of the challenges you've dealt with over the last couple of years, how that has maybe changed your system, whether you've made significant changes to the system, or whether it's been tweaks over the last couple of years, and what have they been?
Yeah, hi Nikki, hi everyone. The biggest challenge is not knowing what's coming next, to be fair. And I think what I've learned the most over the last few years is to make the most of it while it is. So grazing at times of the year perhaps we wouldn't do, or with certain stock class that we wouldn't normally do, because I just don't know when I'm going to be able to graze that again, or with how many cows or whenever. So I think for me, that's been the number one challenge. Is every season now is completely all over the show. I think that the summer's going to be pretty hot. Our autumn calving system is generally set up so that we de-stock in the summer, we de-feed. I think I just made up a new term earlier. So we stop milking the cows, and I guess we've always done that, and that is farmers adapting to the climate in the southeast. So we don't try and produce milk off of grass. Summer grass, because the quality goes. So we build a stockpile and we dry them off, and that's worked generally really well for us. So yeah, like this year, my calves are out a bit longer. The weather's been okay. The ground conditions are just about all right, so I can push them a little bit harder. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dan. And one thing that I'm always really interested in when talking to dairy farmers about a lot of this stuff is actually thinking about the different stock classes that you have. So you've got your milking herd, but then you'll have dry cows and you'll have young stock that are coming through. And do you treat the different groups quite differently in more challenging times? You talked about having your calves out a bit longer and they're kind of staying out. So yeah, are you able, I'm assuming you're able to push your dry cows and your young stock a bit more, and whether you've kind of seen any changes in the rest of the system as a result of that, or because everything's so different every year, is it difficult to keep track of?
I guess we'd always try and prioritize anything which is either producing milk or is growing. So anything that's pregnant, so R2s, so in-calf heifers and dry cows, yeah, they can be pushed a bit harder, so they can be confined a bit more. But there's still a limit to what you can do with them. But yeah, our most important animals on our farm are our young stock. So particularly sort of 0 to 12 months, because that's when we get the most bang from our buck from growing. So the better the quality of feed goes in, we get better growth rates and hopefully increase their lifespan from there and their productivity. Yeah.
Sorry, something weird came up on my computer and I couldn't find mute. No, that's great. Thanks ever so much. So I'm going to come to Fidelity next, if that's okay. So Fidelity, your thoughts on managing in extremes. And Dan, there's a bit of weird feedback. I don't know if you mind muting. That would be
Yeah.
helpful. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, Fidelity, managing in extremes. We've had a couple of really difficult summers. So just keen to hear your thoughts on what differences you've or tweaks you've made to your system to cope with those challenges.
So I think I'd start by saying we've had more than a couple of difficult summers in the southeast. I mean, last summer didn't count, and I've always said before that 4 out of the previous 5 summers have all been difficult. So actually, I think what Dan said about never knowing what's going to happen next is the biggest challenge. But then I think you just have to be totally flexible, but also really willing to take advantage of when you do get the good times. So, for instance, this year we've had loads of grass from the summer. I actually think for the first time I might be able to keep our cows and calves out all winter, whereas normally the cows come in at some point. We've got stacks of grass ahead of us, and I feel that I've got my confidence has grown on putting them onto daily moves with the bale of hay put out there. I mean, it might still get way too wet, but at the moment it seems fine. So I think you have to be pretty opportunistic about your decisions as you go along. And you know, if the grass is really short, really dry, and it's just simply not growing, you know, you possibly will have to eat it all down and then just hope that it rains again in time to rescue you going forward.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I want to come back to on that, Fidelity, but there was a point that you the very end there about eating the grass down and hoping that it rains. Dan, I hope you don't mind me saying that I remember a couple of years ago maybe being in a it was either in a WhatsApp group or a discussion in one of Neil's grazing chats, that I remember you kind of grappling with that challenge of like, actually the grass just isn't growing and it isn't going to rain, and then having to buy in additional forage. So yeah, just any reflections on that kind of grazing and hoping, and have you made any changes as a result of that experience?
It is really challenging. I mean, I was just thinking we do adapt our young stock grazing depending on the weather. I've learned the bitter experience about grazing in wet weather and cell grazing and absolutely destroying fields. And we obviously, that does have an impact on the rest of the season. So we give them bigger areas. You know, we change the shape of the area they're in. A lot of the fields they're in don't have much protection. They're big, wide open arable fields, that kind of thing. It's, you know, like this beginning of this September, we left the grass a bit longer. It was looking really good, and then it was 30+ degrees for about a week, and it absolutely killed it. And then you've got to, then there's a rescue. You want to get in there and eat the grass before it dies. You know, it's stressing the plants out quite a lot. Yeah, I suppose I always try to err on the side of caution. So if I will cut less grass for silage perhaps than maybe I ought to, with the view that I might need an extra 30 acres. I run the risk then of losing quality and losing milk or something, but I try and have a bit of a buffer, Nikki. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dan. There's a point been made by Christine in the chat, which we'll definitely come to, Christine. But before we do, I just want to come back to you, Fidelity, about you were saying about being opportunistic, being adaptable. Sounds like you're kind of contingency focused. So always having like maybe a plan A, B, C, D, and E. And just, yeah, you talked about confidence. And has that confidence just come from doing more of this, trying it, testing it, failing, learning? Like, where's that confidence come from?
I think it has just come from just doing it. And so just little things I've learned. So last year, I was really challenged by the idea of rolling out bales on grass that was sort of 15 inches thick and tall, and thought, I just don't want to do that. I want the cows to eat it down first and then I'll roll out my bale. So I'd have them in sections for 2 days. The first day they eat the grass, the second day they get the bale rolled out. But in actual fact, it wasn't a good idea. And I'm sure that those people around this table who'd been doing it for longer than me would have said, I could have told you that it's not a good idea, because the key is not to have them on there for more than one day. And in fact, you want them to have that length of grass, and you're not wasting your hay, they're not wasting the grass. But I needed to sort of do that for myself. So I feel that I've probably made loads of mistakes, and yeah, but just as long as you're learning all the time, doesn't really matter. And maybe at the end of the day, we have just been incredibly lucky that the rain does just come in on time. It sort of picks up on Christine's thing she's put in the chat about the speed of transition, and I don't know if this is what she means, but I've actually got the most brilliant drone photograph of our farm at the end of not the summer we just had, the summer before, when every field was totally brown, and we really were on the last of our grass. We hadn't got a plan Z, but when it did rain, the amazing thing was that the fields that we had mob grazed came back way quicker than any of the others. So if you're talking about transition, the speed of transition, so by the end of the summer, we had got some fields with mob grazed, some fields we'd taken hay off, and some fields that had been set stocked. And without fail, the ones that had been mob grazed, they all looked as bad as each other, came back far quicker than the rest. So it helps with the transition as well, if the weather is going to change a lot.
Brilliant. That's really great to hear, Fidelity, that reflection about, the comparison between different places on the farm. Christine, can I just invite you maybe to unmute and talk a little bit more detail about, what you mean there about the speed of transitions? Do you mean in terms of how we would make decisions to change what we're doing, or do you mean the actual speed of the change in weather, and talk a bit about the wind speed element as well?
Yes, thank you, Nikki. I think what I have observed in the relatively short period that I've been trying out or helping with these kind of things is that particularly in the springs, you go from very, very soggy, so we're talking about the clay systems again, very, very soggy to bone dry really quickly. And the wind speed has a lot to do with that. I don't know whether there's anything from what other people do elsewhere in the world or whatever to help us deal with the wind speed element, because I think certainly in terms of drying out, we think about the drying northeasterly wind that set in the southeast for 3 weeks in this spring and took us from a cold wet spring to a hot dry spring very quickly. Whether there's any experience from elsewhere about dealing with the wind speeds, apart from plant more trees.
Well, excellent point, Christine. And what I was going to say was about the more structural diversity you have across the farm, both in terms of your covers, but plant, trees, hedges, scrub, all of that is obviously all going to help. But as we know, that can take time to establish, and that can be more challenging. I think, I'll answer first in terms of, because although we're in the very north, we are northeast, so we do have some of those same challenges here, and that northeasterly wind can be really, really challenging. And I think exactly as Fidelity's just put in the chat, that taller grass, that longer covers, having more soil armor, more soil protection, and it's absolutely the thing that we've all kind of been told that we shouldn't be having, and that it prevents growth in the spring. We've all been told for years that we need to clear out those fields, get everything bitten down as much as we possibly can, which I think probably isn't a challenge, isn't an issue, if you know that the weather is going to proceed as follows for the following months. If you kind of got like a clear plan about, this is when the weather gets warmer, this is when this happens, this is when that happens, not having a lot of cover during the winter going into a spring is kind of okay, because you assume that everything's just going to grow. But as you say, we're getting stuck in these kind of weather systems. We're having to deal with these really very unpredictable and very fast changing weather systems that I think are reducing our ability to kind of, exactly as the others have said, know what's coming and to plan ahead. So we have to have these multiple contingencies. The more that we can cover the soil, the more we're going to protect it, whether that's from rain, wind, sun, whatever it is. But it really does challenge everything that most of us have ever been taught about having the right conditions for spring regrowth. But it is amazing. It does just come back. It does grow through the grass. I think we have this expectation that, unless we bite it back really hard in the winter, it's not going to regrow. And I think that actually we have to balance that trade-off between, how quickly it might grow, but also actually it's not going to grow at all if the ground gets really dried out and cracks. But yeah, I'm going to open that up maybe to Sam, or David or Fergus, on your thoughts on kind of how you might be dealing with some of those quick changes, particularly with fast wind speeds. Don't all jump at once, gents. David's coming in. Not really. It sounds like you're down the bottom of a well or something, David. It's got worse than last week. Slightly better, yeah, slightly better.
Yeah, I would agree with Christine that it's a real nightmare, these springs, these cold springs. It goes from cold
no,
and wet.
Can't hear you. That is really muffled. Sorry.
Okay.
No, we're not getting it. We might have to come to you, Sam.
And
maybe David can put his answer in the chat whilst you're speaking. Maybe that's easier. Sorry, Sam. Go on.
That's a good idea. Yes, I think the minimum grass cover that you've got on farm, is very important. I measure with plate metering, or some people use sward sticks, or you can just do it by observation. But when that wind speed, when the high winds do come, as long as you've got a reasonable amount of grass cover, I think it makes a huge difference. But you've got to monitor that. And there's various levers. So if the grass isn't growing in the spring, then you need to slow the cows down, or you can supplementary feed. I guess it's the same any time of year. If there's a drought, you can do the same thing. Also destocking. So if you've got cull cows, maybe moving them on, or finished cattle, you can move them faster. Also related to what Dan was saying about prioritizing feed to different stock classes. So in a drought, you really want to prioritize your finishing cows, because if you can finish them faster, then you can get them off of your grazing platform and protect those covers again. And like Fidelity said, if you do protect those covers as much as possible, when the rain does come, you get a really good response.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sam. And it was interesting, actually. I was just reflecting back on what Fidelity was saying about the fields that had been mob grazed recovered much better once the rain did come after the drought in 2022. And just reflecting on some of the research that's come out from ADAS, who have been doing a replicated mob grazing versus stet stocking trial. And I don't know if any of you are involved in it, actually, but quite a few Pasture for Life farms are. You are, Sam. And what they're finding is that there's much greater earthworm numbers in the mob graze systems than in the set stock systems, because while some of the soil chemical or other soil properties are taking longer than the trial's been running to kind of see significant changes potentially, that actually the increased number of worms is really kind of demonstrating that there's a lot more kind of activity, and hopefully one would then imagine that there's much greater connected porosity underneath those mob grazing areas, which obviously then is helping that kind of air circulation. When that water does come, it's able to infiltrate and able to then to be accessible by the plant roots. So it's all of these things that we're starting to see the research slowly starting to catch up with some of what farmers like Fidelity are seeing on farm, and actually trying to put some kind of science and explanation behind it. Okay, we'll just see if there are any other questions. David's come in on the chat saying would agree with Christine that springs are a problem, reducing stock numbers, slowing down the rotation, and accepting lower animal performance. I think that's a really interesting one, David. I wish that we were able to hear you better, because I think that's a really interesting point, this idea of accepting lower animal performance and kind of being okay with that. And I think particularly if you're Pasture for Life certified, and you don't just have the option to then buy in a load of feed to make up the difference, or if you're particularly concerned about costs and wanting to reduce costs as much as possible and keep control of those and not buying in feed, that accepting lower animal performance, particularly in the animals that you're not prioritizing. So let's say you followed Sam and Dan's advice on prioritizing a particular group of animals, the ones that you're not prioritizing, actually seeing that slightly lower animal performance and being okay with that, because you know that you've got something coming in the bank later on in terms of, you've got those covers so that when it does rain, you're going to get, a flush of growth, or that you've got the opportunity to have animal, to be able to sell animals at a point where other people aren't selling them because you've been able to maintain them through the system. So I think that's a really, really good point, accepting that lower performance, obviously maintaining good health and welfare, but accepting that you might not have those daily live weight gains that you might expect it if all things were ideal. Okay, so just going to pause and see if there are any questions. Nothing at all. I'm interested to know, for those of you who have been kind of managing, did you find any challenges over the last couple of summers? Any of you make changes? Fidelity put a question above. Oh yes, you did, about some of the plants that you were struggling with in the heat.
I was just
So just talk through
anyone...
that, Fidelity. Sorry.
Yeah, so we've noticed that in the last couple of years, especially in that after 2022, that we've lost large quantities of clovers and trefoils out of our lays, and then also got more grasses that we don't much like barley grass, which is a horrible, it looks lovely, it looks like barley, but it's very thin, it's got very little leaf on it. I'm sure it loves the heat, and whether the heat, these hot dry summers are actually changing the grasses that are thriving in the southeast. I just wonder if anyone else has got any thoughts on that.
Any experiences on that, folks?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that it's adapting, like we talked about epigenetics a couple of weeks ago. But no, I think I might have some of that grass, actually, Fidelity. Where my cows are grazing at the moment, I didn't really know what it was, but it's just like you described.
Yeah, looks nice, but it's not very nice.
Fidelity, what's not very nice about it? Did you say it's just a bit sort of thin and just not?
It's really thin. The cattle don't find it palatable, and and the sheep don't. The sheep don't like it at all. So yeah, it's not very good grass. We don't think it's good to have. I'm happy to have a bit of it, but would like to have less of it than we've had in the last couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. Janet makes a really good point in that perennial ryegrass loves our cold, damp climate, and indeed any cultivars have been bred specifically for that, pretty much. So yeah, it will be going in hotter, drier southeast. And I think, actually for many of us who are kind of going into this, particularly out wintering, but also thinking about a more resilient system throughout the year, those much deeper rooting grass really kind of do come through as being winners. Cocksfoot and fescues in particular. I mean, if I can just have a whole field full of cocksfoot for my kind of autumn grazing, I'm very, very happy, because yeah, there's just so much, even though some of it really goes quite rank and quite yellow, actually there's so much benefit elsewhere in the plant that I don't really worry about that too much. And it just really does hold up, particularly here if we get early snow. It sits nice and high above the snowfall, and it means that the cattle still have plenty to eat. But you're right, yeah, and it, as you said, that we will see those potentially those cultivar varieties struggling because they've not been bred for the type of climate that we're now experiencing. Any other questions, folks? I try and leave this last session kind of quite more open for chat, but you're all being very quiet and you're hiding behind your no cameras as well. I feel like
I've got a question.
Go on, Sam. Oh no, don't have a question. You're here for the answers, not the questions.
Did you say that you've got overground pipes for your cattle?
Yeah, everything's overground. Yeah.
I just assume that it's very cold up where you. So can you tell us how you cope with that?
Yeah, sure. So we have a few different systems and a few different things that are set up. For the really, really cold weather where we're kind of -15 for long, maybe for like a week at a time or something, we have made use of continuous flow troughs, which work really well. So we're not on any metered water here, which makes a big difference. We're getting all of our water either from a burn, so like a stream, natural water sources, or from boreholes that are tapping into natural existing water. So nothing's on mains, which makes things a lot easier. But continuous flow works brilliantly, and we've been able to make some quite cheap and cheerful. I say it was all my husband's doing. I'm going to take credit for it though. So like a half IBC with an inflow pipe that's got maybe 100, 150 meters of pipe that runs up a burn. So you get the water flowing down the stream, which means that generally, even when it's really cold, it will still run. So that flows into the trough, and then near the top of the trough, you have an outlet pipe with another pipe running away back into the burn, ideally. So you're basically just allowing water to come down the pipe. So it's from the stream down the pipe into the trough, and then it slowly just is able to come back out again. So the trough never kind of fills and stays full; it's always emptying, which means it's always filling. So that continuous flow was amazing last year. Absolutely blown away by how effective that was in really, really, really cold weather. And we weren't having to kind of break. We might have to break a little bit of ice around the outside, but actually it just kept flowing. It just kept going. The biggest challenge with that is making sure that the inflow pipe stays in the water, so that maybe you'll get a deer kind of going through and kicking it out, or a lot of rain pre-snow, and the stones maybe get knocked about in the bottom of the stream, which knock the pipe out. So it's more a case of just checking that pipe is steady and secure. So that works really, really well. The other option that we have is that we do have a couple of places where cattle can access the water. They can access the streams or the burns, but we're very we really control how they do that and how they access that. So it's not like all the way along a bank, it would just be an inlet. So we just fence off a section that they can just basically get their noses into, and then they have to back out of it, away from it. So they can't get into the water. There's just enough free flowing so they can get their noses in. And that's mostly for a bit of an emergency, so they can go back to that. We also do a few things like having multiple pipes set up. So for example, we might have a header tank at the top of like an IBC header tank at the top of a hill that fills from a natural water supply. And if we're running, I don't know, 150 meters of pipe off that, we'll just have another 150 meters sitting next to it, so that we've always got one empty and one in use, so that we can drain the one in use out, swap onto the empty. And that just means that we can kind of always have a free pipe so that we can fill troughs. And then making use of big water containers. So we've just bought 2 1,000 litre big round troughs that are light enough to be able to move them on your own, which is great. And so we just fill those up, and they just sit at a particular place in the field. Kind of, we hold them as particular, just fill those up and leave them with 1,000 litres in them, so that the animals can come back to them if they need to. And it's much easier just to break the top of one of those than it is to kind of have smaller troughs elsewhere. So kind of holding large volumes of water wherever we can. And we're just about to put in 7 ponds, which will also help with kind of holding water in different places as well. So it takes a lot of planning. Always helpful that we're on lots of slopes. So if you're on slopes, water does tend to kind of either flow, or you can empty pipes more easily. For those of you that are grazing in very flat areas, definitely harder to empty pipes out. And if you're on mains water, it's particularly difficult, and you may then want to bury all your pipes. But the other thing is, if you're burying pipes and you've just got a short stand that kind of comes up out of the ground, if you can either have your connection underground, so you have like an access point that you can put loads of basically sheep's wool and different things to kind of insulate that a little bit. So you can either do that, or if you've just got a kind of stand pipe that you're connecting your pipes into, it's maybe like 50 centimeters, 60 centimeters that you need to defrost, rather than hundreds of meters. So those are the kind of things that there's lots of discussion around in the kind of bale grazing world about how to manage some of that stuff. And you can lose many hours on YouTube looking at how Canadians cope with water in cold temperatures. So hopefully there's some ideas there for some of you that might be of use.
Nikki, I know there's a few people here who are actually grazing herbal lay or cover crop. Do you have any sort of advice that's specifically aimed at them, rather than sort of permanent? I guess general principles apply, but if there's anything specific.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good point, Deborah, because actually cover crops and grazing as part of an arable rotation, I think is way, way harder than grazing, permanent pasture. Permanent pasture is so forgiving. And I think that particularly in wet weather, herbal lays can really just melt, and it can get really, really churned up underfoot. So I do think that, yeah, just being a little bit more conscious if you've got extreme temperatures of being able to move animals a bit more frequently, and just be aware that because they've been cultivated, that basal ground cover, so the, the bare soil on the ground, not looking down from the top of the plant, but if you get down towards the bottom of the plant, there's going to be a lot more bare soil, which does mean that even though there's these kind of expectations that because they're really diverse, they're much better for soil health, totally agree with that. But I do think you need to manage them carefully in those either extreme heat or extreme wet, because they can just the risk of then exposing that bare soil. Though I'm keen to hear, I don't know if some of you, like Dan, you're grazing a fair bit of herbal lays, I guess, with your cows. Is that something you found as a challenge?
Yeah. I was gonna say something. It's because obviously most herbal lays and cover crops are in recently cultivated land. Particularly now with lots of landlords putting in SAM, for SAM3, there's gonna be a lot of these lays around. And yeah, in our experience, you've got to look at the mixture in the lay because they can be really open. So it looks great. Once they're grazed, there's not a lot left there. Lots of big broadleaf plants which take up a lot of area, but obviously once those broad leaves have gone, there's can be big gaps. So yeah, we've made some horrendous messes. We've really mucked up on herbal lays. So yeah, permanent pasture certainly a lot more forgiving. So yeah, you just got to move, a bit like all your rules though, wouldn't it be move them on quick, back fence if you can, all the kind of usual rules of grazing, and stock classes. Like again, if it's wetter, we could put smaller animals on. Nikki, I was going to ask you about in linked to the water troughs about electric fencing in extreme weather, because last year I had to bring my calves in because it snowed for a couple of days, and it just basically all the fences just fell out. They all just sit on the ground and then everything just walks over them. So how do you deal with snow and ice on electric fences if you're using them in those conditions?
Yeah, no, thanks for your thoughts on the herbal lays. I think it's really important. Sorry, I will answer the question about snowy electric fences in a second, but I do think that's a really important point. Like they're not, they have so many benefits, particularly within an arable rotation, but yeah, they do need kind of careful treatment, I think, when grazing. Yeah, we do use electric fence all through the winter when it's really, really bad. That's one of the main jobs, is just going around and like knocking the ice off the fence. There are particular I'm gonna have to ask James in a second, because I think he's downstairs, about the difference between polywire and polybraid, and one of them last year seemed to work really, really well, and it didn't matter how much snow we had. It didn't really sit on the wire. We've also got some kind of thin, just like steel wire as well that can be used for that, like really, really thin, that can go onto a Kiwi Tech reel, which is really heavy, but it's pretty good at keeping the snow off. So yeah, it's just finding a reel of wire that works best. But we definitely have it where it's just bowed between the posts, but keeping it as tight as you possibly can, like really tightening it up on a geared reel, and all those sorts of things. But yeah, and also just keeping your solar panels clear as well, so that your batteries can stay charged, because that's a real challenge, is that in cold weather, as you'll know, batteries don't hold their charge. So kind of making sure that those solar panels are clear, getting bigger solar panels, using a much bigger one than would normally come with the electric fence kit, all of that kind of stuff. So just kind of creating systems that can be a bit more resilient, I suppose. The other thing that we're trying this year, sorry, just coming back to water, is like a bubbler. It's like, I talked about continuous flow. So as long as the water's moving, it tends not to freeze. So I think James has bought a bilge pump that we can then basically just use to bubble the water up in the trough. So for those of you that are on main systems and maybe you don't want to have a continuous flow, you can still create movement in the water by running a pump off your energizer. So if you've got your energizer for your fence and that's all happening anyway, then you can potentially run this pump off it as well. So I'll let you know how that fares, and yeah, hopefully that'll be quite a useful bit of kit. Thank you, Dave. You just highlighted that the poly braid tends to be smoother and not ice up as easily. Yeah, I always forget one of them. I just know it's the good winter reel, but I can never remember whether it's polywire or poly braid. Cool. Are there any other questions? We've got some great collective thinking with Fidelity, Sam, Dan, Fergus, and David, although we can't really hear David, so he'll just have to put it in the chat. Are there any other questions anyone might have, just to call on this collective brain power?
I think David should get some help with his microphone and stuff, because it's really frustrating not being able to hear what you say, David. I'm sure it's something pretty basic. Somebody younger than you'd better sort it out.
We need to maybe dip into the Fipple coffers and see if they can buy you a new headset or a new tablet or something, so that we can make the most of your contribution. Deborah, is there room in the budget to try and make sure that that David's got some better kit?
I'm sure. I'm actually travelling, I think, to Nonnington on Wednesday with David. If you're coming, David, we'll have a look. I can go and I'll take my own earphones, so check it out and see if we can identify where the problem is. Vicky, I was just wondering if there isn't more questions. I know there are people on here who've come to several sessions and aren't quite ready to, or haven't been quite ready up to now to take the leap. So if they are convinced that perhaps the advantages of mobile grazing, in particularly in extreme weathers, is really worthwhile, I wonder whether, given you, as you said, you've got this amazing panel of mentors and yourself, if you can make a suggestion of what a first step might be in terms of setting up.
Yeah, do you want to, Dan, do you want to go? Is there anything kind of, things that you've learned on your journey through this that would be a first step in kind of moving into that grazing system?
Well, I'd try it with the easiest class of stock. So for us, either calves or dry stock. So ones that aren't under as much pressure. Sorry, the calves are under pressure, but ones that are easier to move. So calves have less impact on the ground. So we can maybe confine them into smaller areas and move them more regularly. It's a bit easier. Dry stock, are not under as much nutritional pressure, I suppose. So yeah, it depends. If you've got only one group of cows on your farm, then that is a challenge. But try starting it when the weather's all right. I wouldn't try doing it now, and I wouldn't try doing it in a really horrible wet spring, but I would, find a time of the year where everything's really good and the cows are happy and content. The biggest challenge is always between our two ears. So it's, you can train the animals as long as they're electric fence trained. That's the biggest challenge. So it's just doing a little bit in an easier period of the year, I would think, to start off with, if that's the thing that's worrying you, and then you can build up your knowledge into more difficult times.
That's a really great answer, Dan. Thanks. Yeah, like just doing it in the grazing season, like house or winter, go away from this as much as you want during difficult times. But if you want to give it a go, then definitely, make a start in the spring and see how you get on going through the summer, when you've got scope and space to do that, and you've got a bit of leeway in case it all goes wrong. If it does all go wrong, then just stop and ask for help. Yeah.
One of the farms I went to visit, they kind of set stocking all of their young stock, and he had several groups of them, and he said, it's going to take me more time, isn't it? I was like, well, it's not really, because the setting up of a field might take you a bit of time, but once you've got all the reels and stuff there and the cows get used to it, it's actually a lot quicker. So you've just got to start with one group of cows. He couldn't get out of the mindset that if they're all in one place, I don't ever have to move any of them, but they're all in like 6 different fields and I leave them there all summer. But I was like, well, you'll grow more grass and then you won't be so stressed at the end. It's trying to do little bits at a time, because it is, people have been farming the same way for a long time. It is difficult to move away from that. It's understandable.
That's a really good point, Dan, and a question that I had when I was on a panel a couple of weeks ago from some young farmers who were saying, yeah, totally get that mob grazing or like some sort of rotation is going to be better in terms of grass growth, but how do you find the time? And my response was very much, you know, you haven't got to find the time in addition to all the things you're currently doing. It's about a whole system shift. And given the example that, you know, we've not had to worm anything for 5 years, and so the stress and the time it takes to bring animals, that's cattle, by the way. So the stress and the kind of time it takes to bring all those animals in, the cost of buying wormer, doing all of that kind of management just disappears from the system. So yes, there might be some cost involved in buying some reels, and when you first start out, you're kind of, you know, tripping over electric fence and stuff goes wrong. But actually, whatever the system is, there's always going to be benefits that, you know, we have to try and quantify and offset and think about in terms of, you know, okay, I'm going to have to spend a bit here, but I'll save there. Or, you know, I won't be spending time doing traipsing around 6 different sites for these animals, which means that I can now use that time to put up some fences and, you know, might have more grass at the end. So understanding those differences, I think, is really, really key. Did you want to come back in, Dan, before Fidelity?
Yeah, I just think, and I mean, for me, it just becomes really enjoyable. And there's nothing better than for me than, I mean, okay, it's just the spring, summer, autumn months for me. So I'm not doing it in the northeasterly, you know, the winds and the rain. I'm a bit of a soft southerner, but just try and do it with a group. It's the satisfaction that you get out and enjoy it. Try and, you know, if you just get one group and see what they're doing and realize you can enjoy it, and hopefully it is a bit less stressful, you know, and then you think, well, actually I do like this, I do enjoy it. I think you've got to get enjoyment out of your day. If you're just driving around several fields every day in your Land Rover or something and just checking on the same cows in the same fields, it's pretty dull. For me, it's nice seeing them in different places all the time and seeing the wildlife, following them around, etc. So it's hopefully you get to notice all the smaller things when you're up close and personal, seeing them moving. Yeah.
Yeah, good point. That's why I never want to be using quads to put up fences. That's a very personal decision because I really love walking the ground, putting those fence posts in, seeing those plants, seeing those animals. For me, it brings me so much joy. I don't get to move fences as much as I'd like to because I have too many other things to do. My husband gets all the perks of the job doing a lot of the fences. But yeah, it's such a nice thing. And if that's what brings you joy, then, you know, find that way of doing it. You're right, that kind of finding happiness in the job is so important. Fidelity, sorry, I've kept you waiting for a while with your hand up there.
Oh no, it's fine. I completely agree with Dan. I think you just have to start somewhere. I think the other thing though is you can choose the time of year, but we found it really hard to break into the system. Actually, it was partly because of the droughts, and we were quite overstocked at the time, or anyway, we were stocked right for our land in the way we're managing it. And so you've somehow got to break into a system when you know that you can let a field get ahead of you a bit on the grazing, and that's possibly tricky. And I was going to say, but then I see Emily's message. I know Emily very well. Whatever you do, don't start with sheep because it'll depress you too much, and do it with cattle to start with because it's so much easier. And as Dan says, it's actually quite pleasurable just walking out with one strand of wire. Anything more than that becomes a right faff, if you ask me. So that's my personal view. Don't try with sheep as a beginner.
Excellent point, Fidelity. I think you're so right. And the other thing actually is about if you're buying kit, spend a bit more and go for like mid-range. That was definitely the advice that I think lots of people that I've talked to, like, if you spend a little bit and get really cheap reels, that will go wrong and you'll get annoyed and it'll break and you'll just be really miserable. Whereas if you kind of go for like a mid-range geared reel, that just makes life so much easier and you'll spend less time in knots.
Totally agree. And I think the other thing to think about if you want to walk, and I agree, I'm with you, Nikki, on that part of the nice thing about doing this is that you're walking, you're noticing the changes that the grazing impact is having so much more than if you're whizzing around in your quad. You also want to think about the weight and the compactness and how you're going to carry the stuff so that you, again, for quickness sake, you want a really nice swish system that you can put out quickly. I'd say, I'm not actually aware particularly the price of lots of different ones, but I would go, if you end up spending a lot of money, this is something you're going to be doing every single day. And so you know, it's worth investing in the kit that really suits you to do a nice, easy job and make it enjoyable and not having armloads of awful electric fencing posts that are going all over the place. And just, you know, really research getting the one system that is good for you.
I think that's a really good point. And actually, there was I'm trying to remember their names. There's two brothers that farm in Cumbria, High Hall Farm, Tom and Jimmy Stobbart. And I remember listening to them right at the start of COVID, when carbon calling webinars first kicked off, and we all kind of signed up and just had a chat rather than it being like a webinar presentation. And I remember Nick Renison asking them, tell us a bit about your system. And they talked about how they'd spent 10 grand on fencing equipment, but they'd saved more than 10 grand in the first year because they didn't buy any fertilizer. And so it's just also being able to understand, where the cost savings might come in to try and justify spending some money. And I think that was that really kind of, I just remember it, that was a few years ago now. And it really just stuck with me, this idea that, yes, it's a lot of money to invest, but if it means that you can make savings elsewhere, that would be, that's an annual cost to buy fertilizer. They bought that electric fence once, and that means that every year, they can still use that same kit. So yeah, I do think definitely. And there's also, there's lots going secondhand as well in terms of costs, if you're worried about that.
I mean, 10 grand sounds like a lot of money to spend, Nikki. I'd say you could start off on the Dan basis with spending 1 grand and getting yourself some kit and just start going in one field. And if you do that one field for a couple of years, you'll suddenly realize there's an amazing change in the field. So it's worth it. So you can really do it quite cheaply. And I think one of the big decisions, which again, maybe you have to fiddle around with to start with, is whether you want to have a mains run system or a battery run system. In fact, we have a mains run system, which means you don't have to carry around heavy batteries all the time. It does have its disadvantages because you've got to always have a lead out wire. You've got to have a main sort of skeleton of electricity, which is always running back to the barns. So that does bring its own problems. I mean, overall, I'm pleased that that's what we decided to do, but that is a decision you might need to make fairly early on, or anyway, again, feel your way on it. See how it goes with battery, and then think about, if you were running it from a barn, how would you design it so you've got the flexibility that you want to have.
Yeah, and you can get energizers that you can run off mains or battery, which means if you're not sure, you could invest in one of those energizers, and then that gives you both options in the future. I'm just going to plug a session that we did at Groundswell last summer that wasn't recorded, but we're going to hopefully repeat next Groundswell if any of you are planning to go. And we basically ran 2 kit sessions, so one with Alex Brewster from Pasture and one with James Daniel from Progressive Farming Company, and they basically each did a demo of their kit, and then were able to answer questions like, how do I get decent power, what kit shall I use for sheep, how do I make sure that my animals don't break out. So I really recommend maybe coming to one of those if you are at Groundswell. The other thing to mention, I can't talk about electric fencing without talking about decent earth. So, really, and not decent soil, I mean decent earthing rods. And, always have more than you think you need. Never, ever just have one earthing rod. One is never enough. You always need at least 2, probably 3. And the more earths you have, the better your the ability of that fence to hold its charge and to kick out a decent amount of power. So yeah, that's definitely a key thing to remember. Sorry, we've really gone on to kind of technical kit and equipment here, which wasn't necessarily the plan, but the questions were asked, so we'll stick with that. David says mains with a remote every time. Yeah, remote electric fence is pay the extra money and get a remote. It's really good. It does make things a lot easier. So totally agree with that, David. Right, we've got 5 minutes. Are there any other questions, any other points? I don't know, Sam, if there's anything you want to add to that in terms of where to start, if there's any thoughts you've got, or other kind of top tips.
No, just keep it really simple. Where I started was, instead of 2 fields that were set stocks, we just put them all in one field and moved them every couple of weeks to the other field and then back again. And it's a start, isn't it?
Yeah, it definitely is. And I think those of us that really love it and do daily moves, you kind of get into that habit, but starting somewhere is better than, just getting some sort of rotation in there is really beneficial. And just also in terms of a biodiversity point of view, if you haven't got livestock in an area, then it just is much quieter, and there's much more potential there for ground nesting birds, for hare and leverets, for example, for other animals to make use of that space without animals trampling all over it all the time. So I think it's a really nice way to lift biodiversity on the farm, because you just create a bit more space for everyone to kind of coexist and have quiet spaces where animals aren't frequenting the entire time. Deborah, is there anything else from your point of view in terms of what you wanted to get out of these sessions? I know that you're planning another session with Russ to talk a bit more about some of the kind of economics underlying some of the profitability decisions that particularly Fergus, David, and I have talked about in previous sessions, where we have slightly different ways of addressing or dealing with challenges that is totally dependent on the systems that we're running. Is there anything else that you want to just make sure we touch on before we finish?
I think I just wanted, given that everybody is talking about, well, we're in the theme of starting out, I think landscape analysis, and because some people are new entrants, and I think Janet made a really good point earlier on about the difference between chalk downland and the clay, and I think that maybe if you could speak to that just for a minute, that would be really helpful.
What do you mean in terms of management? Just clarify that a bit.
Well, starting with understanding what your soil is and what the biodiversity potential is and what's there, rather than thinking that you're taking a system from another context with a very different geology and soil and weather or whatever.
Yeah, totally. So the very first thing that we all have to think about is, what are we managing for? And I think I've mentioned that before in these sessions. The very, very first thing you need to identify is what are your goals, what are your aims, what is it that you want to achieve? And I really recommend, if any of you have the opportunity to do your holistic management training with 3LM, even if you just do the fundamentals, it's a really, really good course to help you better understand how to really set the context that you want to achieve, and that really kind of gives you that, what do I want the outcomes on my farm to be? So until you know what you're managing for, and try and be specific, kind of just saying more biodiversity or more money is a bit vague. So try and be specific about what it is you're managing for, and that also then needs to reflect the context of the farm, whether that's your soil type, or whether that is particular habitats that are protected, very kind of specialist habitats. I would always argue the point, though, however, that actually all of these kind of graze and rest approaches can be utilized on any system if you get it right. And I think that's recognizing the flexibility in these systems. So you can increase your paddock size, for example. So actually your stocking density is much lower. You can change the frequency at which you move. You can change the time of year at which you're that you're grazing particular areas. I think that we don't necessarily need to say, well, I don't think I've seen any habitats or landscapes where this approach doesn't work. There is always somebody who's able to make it work, and there are always people who aren't able to make it work. And as Dan said, the biggest kind of challenge to overcome is the bit in your head, and whether you think you can or you can't, you're right. It's all about your mindset in this. So I think that, anybody who sort of says, well, I can't do that approach to grazing because of where I am, I think that there's potential just to slightly or to tweak the approach. And so that's why I'd never ever want to say that these sort of grazing approaches that we know seem to have really, really good benefits for soil health, that they're not fixed. You can't say you have to put this number of animals on this size paddock for this number of days, because it just depends what you want the outcome to be. You could, on times in the autumn when I'm grazing particular areas, we've got massive paddocks with a really small number of animals, and they're moving every 2 days. And there are other times when we've got small paddocks, high animal impact, and they're moving twice a day. And that's the same system, the same farm on slightly different parts of the ground. So you don't have to kind of say, well, this is how I implement this approach. It's really, really flexible, and the flexibility is the most scary bit when you're starting out, because it takes confidence, as Fidelity said. So I think the identify what you've got on your farm, identify the outcome that you want, and there is a huge growing community now of people who are doing this, who are trying this in different settings in different places. And so combining some of that conservation knowledge, particularly around chalk grasslands, alongside some of these grazing approaches, I think really, really will have great outcomes. I don't think any of us at all really understand the potential for biodiversity on many of our farms. I think we've got so used to such a lack. We are kind of shifting baseline syndrome has really made us forget just how productive and how diverse our landscapes can be. So I think that we've all got room to improve that for sure. We are going to be running a chalkland focused grazing webinar in December for one of the other projects. So that is coming up, which you're all welcome to come to. And I think, Deborah, you've been doing quite a lot of work that's very chalkland focused anyway. So there are lots of resources available, but we will be having that conversation a little bit, next month as well. We are at 1:45, so I think we probably are due to finish. A massive thank you to all of our resident experts, so Fidelity, David, Sam. Appreciate your thoughts, and your very locally specific contextual knowledge is really, really helpful. And yeah, I really enjoyed delivering this series of webinars for a second time. Thanks for having me back. And yeah, it's been great to see you all. And please do, if there's anything that you're not sure about, make use of the Pasture for Life forum, because you've all got membership. And also, just feel free to drop me an email, nikki@pastureforlife.org, or Deborah or Sarah can put you in touch with me if that's helpful.
And thank you so much, Nikki. Just quickly, before I thank you formally, I just wanted to say, anybody on here who's a mentee, and if there's any questions that come up, or if you're ready to take another step, do get in touch with your mentors, because the programme has to finish all the activity by mid-February. So perhaps it's a little nudge for anybody who's not quite taken the leap, but is thinking about it, even if you just want to talk it through and it's not the right time right now. But Nikki, thank you so much. Really appreciate you committing to 5 evenings, no matter where you were in the country, what you were doing. You found it somehow the resources to deliver the programmes. I really appreciate that. Thank you. So,
No, you're welcome.
If people want to unmute and say thank you, please do. And